horror game enjoyers. Your new favorite host is back. Look, I think it's fair to say that as a species, humans are deeply, fundamentally broken. We pay money, hard-earned fiat currency that could be spent on artisanal cheeses or therapy just to sit in the dark and let a piece of plastic give us a minor cardiac event. We want to be terrified. But there is a massive psychological difference between watching a horror movie and playing a video game. In a movie, when the inevitable doomed teenager walks into a pitch black basement, you can yell at the screen. You can call them an idiot. You can distance yourself from the impending demise because they are the one making the bad choices. But in a video game, you are the idiot. You are the one pressing forward on the analog stick. You are the one walking into the basement. The dread is entirely your fault. This is the cup filled with the blood of my enemies. Oof, a lot of cortisol. Exactly how I like it. It's our lifeline as servants of Jezebel. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. In the late 90s, game developers discovered that the best way to scare you wasn't actually through hyper-realistic monsters or buckets of digital gore. It was through mechanistic friction. They designed terrifying limitations. Take the original Resident Evil. Everyone remembers the infamous window dogs, a classic jump scare that caused a generation of children to wet their metaphorical trousers. But the real horror of Resident Evil wasn't the zombie dogs, it was the controls. Tank controls. A control scheme so universally reviled by modern audiences that it has basically been classified as a human rights violation. For you children in the audiences who grew up with fluid 360-degree camera movements, let me explain. Tank controls meant that pressing up on your D-pad moved your character forward in whatever direction they were facing. To turn, you had to stop completely and pivot on an axis. Now, Capcom didn't invent tank controls because they were sadists. They did it because the original PlayStation couldn't render a fully 3D environment in real time. The backgrounds were static, pre-rendered 2D images. So when your character walked across the room, the camera angle would suddenly cut to a completely different perspective. If up always meant north, your character would instantly start running backwards the second the camera shifted, causing a kind of digital vertigo. Tank controls were a brilliant, elegant solution to a technical nightmare. But a funny thing happened on the way to the asylum. That technical limitation became the ultimate tool for psychological warfare, because you couldn't move the camera. You couldn't see what was hiding around the corner. You could hear the zombie groaning, wet and ravenous, but it was trapped in a cinematic blind spot. The game forced you to fight the hardware just to survive. And then of course, there was Silent Hill. Enter Team Silent, a group of self-proclaimed corporate outcasts inside of Konami who looked at the PlayStation's pathetic rendering distance and said, what if we turned the graphical trash into existential trauma? The PS1 simply couldn't draw the town of Silent Hill without the frame dropping to the single digits. It was a hardware bottleneck, so the developers threw a digital modesty blanket over the entire game. They covered the town in thick, suffocating fog. The fog wasn't an artistic choice born out of a profound reading of Stephen King. It was a smokescreen to hide the fact that the world literally wasn't loading fast enough. But visually, it shifted the genre from survival horror to epistemological horror, the fear of what you can't see. Or worse, the fear that reality around you is actively dissolving. So by the turn of the millennium, horror gaming has established a beautiful, symbiotic relationship with its own limitations. Fear was a geometry problem. It was about fixed camera angles, clunky movements, and obscured vision. Developers had perfected the art of manipulating their environment to make you feel vulnerable. But what happens when the developer decides to stop manipulating the environment and start manipulating you? Well, in 2002, a developer named Silicon Knights did exactly that. They built a masterpiece of psychological meta-horror that didn't just break the fourth wall, it shattered it with a sledgehammer. It was brilliant, it was revolutionary. And then, a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire named Nintendo saw it, fell in love with it, and immediately called their lawyers to ensure that no one else could ever do it again. So let us talk about the day Nintendo panned panic. Let us paint a picture of 2002. The world is collectively recovering from the Y2K panic, also 9/11. Low-rise jeans are pushing the absolute limit of human anatomy, and Nintendo, a company built entirely on the wholesome back of a cheerful Italian plumber, releases a video game console that looks like a neon purple lunchbox with a handle. It was cute. It was non-threatening, but if you opened up that cute little lunchbox in the summer of 2002, popped in a tiny proprietary optical disc, and booted up a game called Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, that toy would spend the next hour actively trying to convince you that you were losing your goddamn mind. Eternal Darkness was an ambitious Lovecraftian horror epic developed by a Canadian studio called Silicon Knights, led by a man named Dennis Dyack, or Dyke. I don't want to risk saying that. It was a multi-generational narrative spanning 2 millennia, involving Roman centurions, Cambodian dancers, Franciscan monks, and a lot of very angry, ancient cosmic deities with way too many eyeballs. But the game's true stroke of genius wasn't its narrative.
I am Dr. Edward Roivas. I am a clinical psychologist. I am also dead.
It was a little green bar in the user's interface known as the sanity meter. The loop was deceptively simple. Every time a character encounters a grotesque, flesh-peeling monster, their sanity meter would drain. If you killed the monster with a finishing move, you regained some sanity. Simple, right? Standard video game resource management. Except, Dennis Dyack and his team didn't want the consequences of low sanity to just be a stat penalty. They didn't want your character just to run a little slower or hit a little softer. They wanted your character's psychological disintegration to bleed directly through the screen. They called them sanity effects, and initially, they started small. They stayed inside the boundary of the game world. You'd walk into a room and the camera angle would suddenly tilt slightly to the left, like the world was sliding off its axis. You'd hear footsteps behind you that weren't yours. Sometimes you'd enter a room and you'd see droplets of blood on the wall. Other times you would randomly lose most of your limbs. Oh yeah, and there's this scene with the books. This is just camp. And then, a second later, blink, it comes back to normal. Now, as a player, this is all delightful. It's spooky, it's atmospheric, it's great fun. You think to yourself, wow, what a creative video game. My character is really having a bad time. You still feel safe. You're the omnipotent god holding the controller, looking down upon your suffering digital avatar. And that is exactly when Silicon Knights decided to pull the rug out from under you. Because the developers realized that the human brain can adapt to environmental weirdness inside of fiction. If a room fills with blood in a horror game, your brain rationalizes it. Ah yes, a classical horror trope. But what if the game stops messing with a character and starts weaponizing your actual, real-world anxiety of your expensive home electronics? Imagine it's 2002. You're 13 years old, and it's 2 a.m. You're sitting on a dusty bean chair in your parents' basement. Suddenly, your TV screen goes completely black. The green video input text flashes. Did the GameCube power cord just slip out? Before you can even stand up, the screen flashes back to life. The volume bar of your television appears at the bottom of the screen, and it slowly, systematically, moving to the left. You would scramble around in the dark, frantically feeling for the remote control. You're mashing the volume up of your actual TV, but nothing is happening. The game is silent, the room is silent, and your heart is pounding. You are experiencing genuine biological panic. And then, boop, the game cuts back to normal volume, and a zombie bites your face off. They didn't just trick your character, they tricked you. They bypassed the digital middleman and attacked the relationship between the human and the machine. They turned your hardware against you. But that wasn't even the most sadistic trick. Not by a long shot. See, in the year 2002, there was no cloud storage, there's no autosave, there was no digital safety net. If you played a massive 30-hour role-playing or horror game, your whole entire life's work is stored in a fragile plastic square the size of a Ritz cracker, the memory card. If that card got corrupted, or if your save file got wiped, it wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. So what did Eternal Darkness do? You would try to save one of your games after long hours of playing, and after the saving is complete, a message will appear asking if you're sure you want to delete all of your saved games, and then automatically start deleting your saved games. You can imagine how one would be panicked, and suddenly it flashes back to normal again.
Yes, it got me.
It's almost impossible to overstate how revolutionary this was. You couldn't do this in a movie, and neither in a book. A book cannot pretend to set itself on fire while you're reading page 40. Silicon Knights had tapped into a brand new wellspring of human terror. They discovered that the ultimate horror wasn't the monster under the bed, it was the realization that the rule of the system you trusted had been completely rewritten without your permission. It was brilliant. It was high, elevated art, and it can be considered a milestone for the entire media. And Nintendo, who financed the game, looked at the breathtaking artistic breakthrough, smiled warmly, and said, "Wow, this is incredible! We are going to put this in a legal cage and bury it under a mountain of copyright paperwork so that no other human being can ever use it again." let us talk about patents. There's a specific kind of corporate violence that can only be perpetrated by corporate lawyers. See, art is messy. Art is emotional. It's born out of the late-night caffeine binges, existential dread, and the chaotic desire to make another human being, on the other side of the screen, feel a specific vibration of terror. But law takes the raw human lightning, pours it into a sterile beaker of bureaucracy jargon, and boils it down until it reads like an instruction manual for an industrial washer. On December 14th, 2000, almost 2 years before Eternal Darkness ever hit store shelves, Nintendo of America filed a document with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. On August 30th, 2005, the document was officially approved. Its title, Sanity System of Video Games. Now, let's read the abstract of the document together, because it is a masterpiece of unseasoned, boiled chicken pose. A video game or a game system incorporating a game character's sanity level that is affected by occurrences in the game, such as encountering a game creature or a gruesome situation. A character's sanity level is modified by the amount determined based on the character's reaction to the occurrence, such as taking rest, or slowing game progress, and or an amount of character's preparation. That is, if a character is prepared for the particular occurrence, the occurrence may have little to no effect to the character's sanity level. As the character's sanity level decreases, gameplay is affected, such as by controlling game effects, audio effects, creating hallucinations, and the like. In this context, the same game can be played differently each time it is played. I don't know why I took a British accent. I know they're Japanese.
Exactly.
Let's translate that from corporate Google to actual human English. Nintendo didn't patent the code of Eternal Darkness. They didn't just patent the specific art assets or the grotesque, multi-eyed flesh monsters. They legally patent the concept of a fictional character getting stressed out and the concept of the game lying to the player as a result. Let's think about how absolutely unhinged that is from a creative standpoint. If you are a game developer, and you want to make a game where a character sees a ghost, and then the audio track suddenly starts whispering to simulate a panic attack, congratulations! You are now legally infringing on the intellectual property of Nintendo of America. Now, if you're a normal human being with a healthy, functioning brain, you might be asking, wait, how is this even allowed? I thought you couldn't patent general ideas. And you would be right. In theory, patent law is supposed to protect specific, concrete inventions. You can patent a type of physical engine valve, you can patent a specific chemical formula for a pharmaceutical drug, but you can't patent the concept of traveling fast. You can't patent sadness. But software patent law in the United States, to use precise legal terms, a complete utter circus. In the late 90s and the early 2000s, tech companies realized that if you took a completely normal, abstract concept, added the words on a computer or via electronic display to the end of it, the patent office would just rubber stamp it. The bureaucrats checking these applications didn't know what a video game was. They were 50-something government employees whose only experience with digital entertainment was playing Minesweeper during the fucking lunch break. And when Nintendo showed up with a 50-page document full of flowcharts and diagrams showing a little digital man encountering a skull, the patent office went, "Ah, yes, a highly complex electronic system. Fascinating. Here's your monopoly, Mr. Nintendo." And Nintendo wasn't the only corporate empire colonizing the landscape of human imagination. The early 2000s were a rush of anti-competitive mechanical land grabs. You have Bandai Namco patenting playable minigames during load screens. You have Sega patenting a giant floating arrow guiding players from Crazy Taxi. You got Warner Bros. Patenting the Nemesis system from Shadow of Mordor. Every single one of these patents is a tragedy, but Nintendo's patent on Panic was uniquely devastating. Because while Bandai patenting loading screen minigames was an act of pity and capitalistic annoyance, Nintendo patenting the Sanity System was an act of cultural enclosure. They took a knife to the throat of an entire genre's psychological evolution. See, the specific wording of exemplary claim in Patent 954 was so broad and so intentionally nebulous that it acted as a legal radioactive zone. It didn't just cover the fake television volume slider, it covered any modification of the game's output signals, audio or visual, based on the internal calculation of the character's fear. If an indie developer wanted to make a psychological horror game about a soldier experiencing PTSD, their lead programmer would look at Nintendo's patent and say, "We can't do this. We don't have the capital to fight Nintendo in court. If their legal goon squads decides that this looks too much like Patent 954, they will litigate us into literal bankruptcy before we even get discovered." The law doesn't just govern what happens in the courtroom. It governs what happens in the writer's room. It governs what happens in the design docs. The moment this patent was granted, it erected a massive, invisible neon sign over an entire landscape of survival horror that reads, "Do not mess with the fourth wall. We own it! Silicon Knights had discovered a brilliant new language for interactive storytelling, and then Nintendo bought the exclusive rights to the alphabet and left the entire industry stuttering in the dark. So what happened next? What happens to a genre when its most potent weapon is rendered legally radioactive? Well, the horror genre didn't die. It was forced to mutate. It was forced to tiptoe around the borders of Nintendo's legal empire, leaving an entire generation of games to suffer the consequences of a corporate embargo on panic. Boom, change scene again. So, in legal philosophy, there's a concept known as a chilling effect. Now, despite sounding like an incredibly niche subgenre of atmospheric ambient techno, a chilling effect is actually a deep depressing psychological phenomenon. It happens when law, or a patent, or the vague threat of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit is so broad and terrifying that people choose to self-censor. They don't wait to get sued. They don't wait for the cease and desist letter to arrive in their inbox wrapped in corporate brimstone. They look at the sheer terrifying scale of the Leviathan, and they voluntarily change their behavior to avoid catching its eye. They just stop trying. When Nintendo locked down US Patent 954, they didn't unleash a wave of high-profile courtroom dramas. Mario didn't walk into a courtroom in a tailored suit to personally sue an indie developer into the dirt. They didn't have to. The mere existence of the patent acted as a legal radioactive parameter. For nearly 2 decades, the entire survival horror genre had to perform a delicate, exhausting, and legally mandated tightrope walk. Developers had to ask themselves a genuinely absurd question before writing a single line of code. Is this psychologically horror mechanic too creatively similar to Nintendo's intellectual property? And nowhere is the trauma of this tightrope walk more obvious than the design of the undisputed king of 2010's PC horror, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. If you played PC games in 2010, Amnesia was your entire personality. It was the game that launched 1,000 YouTube streaming careers. Developed by a tiny Swedish studio called Frictional Games, Amnesia completely revitalized a dying genre by stripping away your weapons and forcing you to rely entirely on stealth, resource management, and a sanity system. Yes, Amnesia had a sanity system. If Daniel stood in the dark for too long, or if he stared directly at the monsters, his sanity would plummet. But look closely at how Frictional Games had to implement the system. Look at what happens when Daniel loses his mind. Daniel's vision gets distorted, the screen wraps, he starts to stumble and crawl, you hear cockroaches skittering across the floorboard. It is deeply atmospheric, incredibly effective, and completely terrifying. But you know what it doesn't do? It never lies to you. The player. Amnesia never pretends your monitor is turning off. It never simulates a blue screen of death. It never pretends to corrupt your hard drive or alter your computer's master volume. Why? Because Frictional Games programmers weren't idiots. They knew exactly where Nintendo's legal landmines were buried. Nintendo's patent specifically laid claims to sanity systems that modified the hardware output signal. The visual and audio display elements meant to deceive the player into thinking the machine itself was malfunctioning. So Frictional Games had to pull their punches. They had to keep the horror strictly localized inside the frictional reality of Daniel's skull. They could deform the game world, but they couldn't touch the interface. The fourth wall had to remain completely pristine, reinforced with corporate concrete, because Nintendo owned the rights to breaking it. And Amnesia was one of the lucky ones. It actually made it out of production. Think about the games that were strangled in the crib. Think about the entire subgenre of psychological meta-horror that simply does not exist because developers were too terrified to pitch it. Throughout the mid-2000s and 2010, cosmic horror games like Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, or tactical horror games like Suffering had to consistently sanitize their psychological mechanics. Sanity became nothing more than a glorified second health bar. It became a stat. If it drops to 0, you take damage or you die. How intensely boring. How tragically uninspired. We went from a game that literally simulates destruction of your real-world childhood memories to a game where a little number goes from 100 to 0. Nintendo effectively took the most experimental, avant-garde, boundary-pushing frontier of interactive narrative design and forced it to behave like a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. I'm losing my words. And here's where the story gets truly weird, because human creativity is a stubborn, resilient little weed. If you put concrete over it, it will spend years finding a microscopic crack in the pavement just to sprout a single, distorted leaf. By the late 2010s, a new generation of indie developers realized that if they couldn't build a system that calculated sanity without getting sued by Pikachu's legal team, they would just bypass that said system. They looked at Nintendo's patent and realized a crucial legal loophole. The patent specifically targeted game mechanics tied to an in-game character's calculated sanity level. So the indies said, fine, we don't give the character a sanity meter. We won't calculate their sanity at all. We will just make the entire game an unhinged, haunted piece of malware that directly attacks the player. And enter the era of malware horror. Games like I'm Scared, gaze, happy pride. Games like I'm Scared, 2012, didn't care about your character's sanity. Instead, the game would randomly close itself, drop a literal text file into your actual Windows desktop that reads, I'm watching you, and force you to navigate your computer's file directory just to progress. Terrifying. Or look at Doki Doki Literature Club, 2017, a game that presents itself as a sugary sweet anime dating simulator, only to systematically unravel into a psychological nightmare where a character becomes self-aware, deletes the file scripts of her rivals, and forces you to manually delete her character file from your hard drive to beat the game. These games were brilliant. They completely broke the fourth wall. And they were legally safe from Nintendo because there was no actual sanity system. The fourth wall breaks aren't an algorithmic reaction to a character's fear, they were hard-coded narrative events. And while malware horror is fantastic, it shouldn't have been the only way to experience meta-terror for 20 years. Think about the sheer amount of friction required just to make something creative during the lifespan of that patent. Think about the solo developers working in their bedrooms. Think about the college students making free mods, the small studios trying to secure funding. They didn't have a team of corporate intellectual property lawyers to read through exemplary claim 1 of patent 954. They didn't know the precise legal difference between a hard-coded event and an algorithmic system. All they knew is that Nintendo owned a patent on games that messed with your head, and so they chose to make something else. They made another generic zombie shooter. They made another Slash clone. They made something safe. The true body counts of Nintendo's patent isn't a list of cancelled games we can read about on Wikipedia. It's the infinite cemetery of ideas that were never even written down. It's the collective stagnation of an entire artistic medium, all because of a corporation decided that the feeling of your chest tightening in front of a CTR television was a proprietary commodity that belonged exclusively to them. But patents don't last forever. Even the most ironclad corporate monopolies have an expiration date. On August 30th, 2021, a quiet miracle occurred in the archives of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. No bells rang. No choir of indie developers burst into songs. But on that day, US patent number 954 officially expired. The legal cage that held the sanity system captive for 20 years simply dissolved into a bureaucratic ether. Technically speaking, right now, as you're watching this video, the fourth wall is completely unprotected. Anyone can make a horror game that simulates a television volume drop. The alphabet belongs to the public again. But if you look at the landscape of modern horror gaming, you won't see a sudden glorious renaissance of algorithmic sanity effects. We weren't flooded with a wave of Eternal Darkness spiritual successors. And that's because 20 years is a lifetime in the software development world. By the time the patent died, the industry had already built entire highways around the radioactive zone. The genre had adapted to live without it. The late, great cultural theorist Mark Fisher popularized the term that perfectly encapsulates this depressing reality: capitalist realism. Fisher defined it as the widespread sense that capitalism is not only the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. When applied to art, capitalist realism does something truly sinister. It convinces us that corporate colonization of human expression is just the natural order of things. We've been so thoroughly conditioned by intellectual property law that we look at a multi-billion-dollar corporation copywriting a human emotion and we think, well, yeah, business is business. They invented it, so they owed it. But did they really? Did Nintendo invent panic? Did Dyack and the team at Silicon Knight discover a brand new continent of human psychology that had never been touched before by an artist? Of course not. They were standing on the shoulder of giants. They were riffing on H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan, and Rod Serling. They were participating in a millennia-old human tradition, the communal campfire story, where one person tells a terrifying lie, and the next person takes that lie and makes it a little weirder, a little darker, a little more profound. Imagine if Alfred Hitchcock had patented the dolly zoom in '58. Imagine if his legal team filed paperwork stating that the Universal Studios officially owned the cinematic representation of Vertigo. If they had done that, Steven Spielberg couldn't have used it in Jaws to show the pure, visceral terror on Brody's face when the shark attacks. Martin Scorsese couldn't have used it in Goodfellas to simulate Henry Hill's paranoia at the dinner. The entire visual grammar of modern cinema would be fundamentally crippled, missing a vital, structural pillar. All because one man's corporate backers decided to fence off a piece of the human experience. Art requires Creative Commons to breathe. It demands that we be allowed to steal from each other, to misremember each other, to iterate on each other's breakthroughs. When you turn a creative breakthrough into a proprietary commodity, you're freezing it in ember. And that is the ultimate paradox of Nintendo. They are a company capable of manufacturing pure, unadulterated childhood joy, a company that has given us some of the most whimsical, transcendent, and artistic experiences in human history. But they protect that joy with the ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency of a nuclear superpower. They will sue a fan-made museum into oblivion. They will take down soundtracks of games they haven't sold in 30 years. They will patent the concept of fear itself if it meant protecting their quarterly margins. So where does this leave us? The pan on panic is dead, but the system that created it, well, is healthier than ever. Right now, as you're sitting down here, corporate legal teams are drafting new patents for mechanics you haven't even played yet. They are patenting procedural dialogue generation systems. They are patenting specific virtual reality movement algorithms. They are patenting the ways AI can track your eyes movement to predict when you're about to look away from an advertisement. Oh, that's true terror. The frontier of human creativity is constantly being carved up into a real estate before the creators even had a chance to build on it. We look back at the story of Eternal Darkness and US Patent 954 as a weird, quirky piece of video game trivia, a funny anecdote about the time a purple lunchbox tried to gaslight a generation of teenagers. But it's not trivia, it's a warning. It's a reminder that if we aren't careful, the spaces where we go to play, to feel, and to be terrified will no longer belong to the artists who dreamed them up, or to the audiences who inhabited them. They will belong to the executors, the auditors, and the lawyers. And honestly, if you're looking for something that can give you a genuine biological pants-wetting panic attack, you don't need a green sanity meter for that. All you need is to look at the mirror. I'm stuck. Whew. I think this is the longest video I've ever made. I hope you guys enjoyed this video that I made. I don't know what else to say. Please, 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 please subscribe and share this video if you enjoyed it. Or if you didn't, please tell me why in the comments. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye. Thank fuck.
Brenda, do something! Okay!